you do also, though, I think, share a lot of really challenging sort of information and explore challenging themes. And as you said, this is your first book for children. Was it harder for you to write that for children than it would have been, say, if you were writing for an adult audience?
It was hard to get the right balance. I don't want to talk down to kids. And by the way, kids live through bombs dropping on their homes. Kids live through forced migration. Kids live through slavery and the sex trade and all sorts of awful things. Children experience the worst things going in this world. So if they experience them, I don't see why they can't read about them. And of course, each child and their families will come to books, as they're ready. But I don't want to talk down to children or shield them from hard issues. But I also want to give a child a reason to laugh and to feel buoyant and to feel excited and to feel like this is fun and playful. Yeah, I don't like what's going on in this story in terms of this social injustice, but what a riot this is to step into this story. And so maybe even more than an adult, I want to really entertain that child and make them happy and excited about turning the page and laugh a little bit. And, I want to give a child a lift, a boost, even more so than I'd want to give an adult one. And so it doesn't mean there aren't painful or awful things that happen. There are. But I want to leave the child feeling optimistic and good and feeling happy and also feeling wildly and wickedly entertained. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of ridiculous language and playful language, which I love. There are words like goozlum, which I never heard said except from my father's mouth. I don't know if anybody else uses the word, but my father did. I'm not sure if he invented it or if he learned it in the army in World War II. I'm not sure, but a goozlum is sort of like this imaginary organ in your body that represents the soul. And if you're a good person, maybe you'll have a goozlum. And it's located just north of the hippo flump and a little to the west of the Sibberley, but it's in the body. And so the goozlum is a word that shows up in this book. And Croc Harry tries to insult Beatrice's intelligence by calling her a willy lump, which is she does not appreciate, but that just means somebody who's lacking in intelligence. And so there's a lot of playful, colorful language, most of which I learned, in my father's knee. And I guess I was trying to entertain myself and comfort myself with the wild, raucous language of my own family household when I was a boy. Yeah. And I was trying to recreate that because it was so fun to live in that world again.
Yeah, I certainly I loved the dictionary at the back because you could go back and so highly recommend a physical copy of the book instead of the ebook because it was much easier to flip back and forth and kind of look at the word and read it and remind myself what it was about as I was going through and reading the book. So it was really fun to read in that respect.
The St. Lawrence Dictionary of Only the Best Words Really Concocted is the name of the dictionary at the back of the book.
Yeah.
I had to fight for that.
Did you?
Editor didn't want to. Nope. She said she was a great editor, fantastic. Went through 12 drafts of that book. But Suzanne Sutherland, wonderful editor, she said, no dictionary. You can't have a dictionary at the back of a kid's book. No, Larry, no. And I just kind of accepted that for the first few months of rewrites. And then Miranda, my wife, said, come on, fight for that. You love that dictionary. It's so playful. And it's an extension of the novel because I get to have silly definitions of silly words, and it really entertained me because I love dictionaries, by the way. And so I went back and I fought for it and finally got it in the book, and I love it. And it's and I've heard already from a number of children who really love the dictionary and all the silly words in it.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what kind of new words we hear kids using once your book's been out for a while and they've been able to read it and go back to that dictionary time and time again.
Should I tell you my favorite?
Yeah, please do.
My favorite is Croco hypo.
Oh, yes. Okay.
It's a problem. It addresses a serious problem in this world. Crocodiles are reading less and less these days. They're not getting good jobs. They're not getting higher education. They're sort of falling back in the social hierarchy. And so we need to address this Croco hypoliterosis, this problem by which they're reading less and less. It's a serious issue. So Croco hypoliterosis. Crocs aren't reading enough these days.
A mouthful in and of itself, right? So it almost like, we'll maybe do one more, if you don't mind, one more question that I'll ask you, and then we'll maybe open it up to the audience, because I'm sure lots of folks have questions or comments or things that they'd like to discuss as well. Just in the vein of us talking about sort of a children's book versus an adult book, it almost seems like there's this sort of false dichotomy between what constitutes a children's book versus an adult's book. And I think, your book is an example. The Harry Potter series is another good example of, the Hunger Games, all of these books that seem to be written for one particular audience, but kind of find their home amongst a wide range and age range of readers.
Yeah, I mean, the world is so segregated in terms of the way books are marketed. Going to a library, going to a bookstore, kids' books here, adult books there. I have no problem with them being arranged like that physically, but it's a little ridiculous when you think about it, because many children are reading adult literature. My children were reading, Steinbeck and other writers when they were very under 10, like when they're very young. And I was reading fascinating and rich adult literature by African Americans when I was 13 and 14. And also as a parent, I read often for the first time and loved many children's books. I loved Anne of Green Gables for its verbal playfulness. I loved Charlotte's Web. That's one of my all-time favorites. Mm-hmm. Or, The Reluctant Journal of Henry K. Larson, I read recently. Loved that book. It's a book for kids as well. And so, I mean, The Little Prince, Charlotte's Web changed the way I thought about spiders. And it changed the way I imagined spiders because I was so entranced by Charlotte, in the novel.
It is a great book.
And so, I mean, a good book is a good book, and many children will read an adult novel, and many adults will read a children's novel. So I just think that the arbitrary distinctions are a little ridiculous. And I love speaking to, both adults and children. And I love the idea that this book might reach both readers.
Yeah. So certainly Larry and I could probably talk for hours about random topics and move from one to the other. But maybe we'll just, what I'll do is I'll hand it over to Anu and Evelyn, who are going to help moderate the Q&A portion of our evening. And I'll keep us unmuted. And that way, Larry will be able to respond to some of the questions that have come through.
For sure. And just a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, you can either use the chat function or the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll be sure that Dr. Hill gets to hear your questions. So we'll just start off with a question from Kelly. She would appreciate any suggested readings on Black history in Canada, if you have any.
Oh, thank you, Kelly. Well, there are so many. You should talk to a good librarian, in any good library who could point you to the books on their shelves there. But my father wrote the first popular history of Black people in Canada. It was called The Freedom Seekers, Blacks in Early Canada. My father's name was Daniel G. Hill, and it came out in 1980. It's still in libraries today. And it was the first book written for the popular reading market about Black history in Canada. But there are many, many books. Afua Cooper has written a stunning book about slavery in Montreal called The Hanging of Angelique. That would be another example. James Walker has written a fabulous book about the Black Loyalists of Nova Scotia called The Black Loyalists. And so there are many, many books, and I don't think I could possibly cycle through all of them. Now, if you send me an email, through my website, just my name, lawrencehill.com, I could give you a few more tips. But I suggest that you go to a good library, whether it's a commercial library or a university library is also a great place to go, and talk to a librarian and get some ideas about where to go. There are many, many books about the history of Black people in Canada, and I think it's great that you should dig into them. I will say one thing, and that one of the most interesting ways to begin to discover Black literature and Black history is to read the slave narratives, the narratives by people who were enslaved, who got themselves free, and he wrote their stories, their personal autobiographies, in order to write about and insist on their freedom, to affirm their freedom, and to share their lives with other people. And the autobiography, the slave narrative, is the first form of Black literature that's widely read and published around the world. And so whether these are African Canadians or African Americans or those in the Caribbean, slave narratives are among the richest forms of Black literature and the oldest. And so if you're really interested in understanding Black literature, the slave narrative is at the bedrock, and there are hundreds of them. Some of them are just 5 or 10 pages long. Others are several hundred pages long. Some of them are world famous, others obscure. But in any good library, there'd be a number of slave narratives as well.
Thank you so much for that answer. Okay, we are getting more questions. So I guess I can ask this one. Okay, so this is from Stephanie. So Stephanie says that she is an Indigenous midwife and could not believe that the Book of Negroes was written by a man. She said it was incredibly precise. So how did you find a midwife or doula to help you with that? And what did your consultant bring that you didn't know?
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, there's a lot of things I didn't know. There are still many things I don't know. And of course, often novelists, they end up writing about things that they don't know because we're generalists. We're not specialists. So when we dive into a subject, we have to learn about it as best we can in order to write about it convincingly. The journey began in West Africa, where I've worked a few times as a volunteer over the decades. And when I was in Mali working as a volunteer with Crossroads International, I met a midwife named Aminata in a little village with no running water, no roads, no schools, no doctors. She was all alone catching babies by herself in a little mud brick home. And she just did it by herself. And her name was Aminata. And I was so struck by her capabilities, her strength, doing this all by herself, that I ended up naming my first daughter after her. Aminata is the middle name of my eldest daughter, which then became the name of my protagonist in the Book of Negroes. So it began by meeting Aminata, the midwife. My first wife, Joanne, and I had children using midwives. And of course, my wife, Miranda, also used midwives for Evangeline and Beatrice. And Miranda's written a book about midwifery. And so she helped me learn a lot. I read a lot of accounts of midwifery and of childbirthing at the time that my novel set, in the mid to late 1700s, especially. And so I had to learn a lot about it that way. So first person accounts, letters, diaries, and then speaking with a lot of experts, and then showing my book in draft form to women who knew a lot about midwifery and childbirth, who could tell me, Larry, you really screwed up there. You better fix that problem before it goes to print. So I share my work quite liberally with people who know more than I do about the things I've written about. And so I get a lot of advice when I'm drafting from people who are knowledgeable about certain areas of the book. So I wouldn't ask them to read the whole book, but if they're a midwife, say, I'd ask them to read the section that had to do with childbirth. And so I do consult a lot as I'm writing to get feedback to help me catch my mistakes, and so I can, make the work better before it's published.
So thank you for answering that question. There's another question from the audience. This one's a bit of a mouthful, so I'll go as slowly as possible. Recently, there's been a lot of discussion around the teaching of critical race theory in schools. It concerns me that this might censor teaching or discussions around Black history and lived experience in particular. As an author, I would love to hear your thoughts on how we teach and talk to students and navigate this currently, if you're comfortable. And the person says, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm comfortable. Critical race theory, first of all, I'm not a sociologist, or a scholar of critical race theory. So let's get that straight. I'm a novelist and a screenwriter, so I'm not an expert. But critical race theory basically is a way of examining and thinking about racial injustice and understanding racial injustice and racial hierarchy in the world and how it's affected particularly Black and Indigenous peoples. And so people who are complaining about critical race theory, like poisoning the minds of children, are basically saying, in my opinion, we don't want children to develop a critical lens about the meaning of racism, the origins of racism, the origins of racial hierarchy and racial oppression. As far as I'm concerned, to oppose critical race theory is basically to say, we don't want our children learning critically about how to assess and understand the origins of social injustice and of racism. So it's a huge, big word, critical race theory, but really what it means is understanding social injustice through the prism of race and understanding how injustice has been perpetrated, over the centuries along this axis. So I have absolutely no trouble. The term really has only been bandied about, over the last decades. But people have been talking about racial injustice for centuries. And so I have no problem whatsoever talking about it. On the contrary, much of my work is to dramatize and illustrate the social and racial injustice and the power differentials between people and the struggles that people have had to go through to survive. So whether they learn about it through scholarship, like academic scholarship and reading an essay that engages in critical race theory, whether they're reading, a fantastic article or essay, in the New York Times or the Globe and Mail, or whether they're reading a novel like the Book of Negroes or Beatrice and Quack Harry. There are 1,000 ways to engage in kind of understanding the plight of human beings. And I would say that every generation strives to come to terms with the injustice that's been perpetrated against humanity. Do you think that in 20 or 30 years, children will no longer be interested in the Holocaust? Well, of course not. There will be scholars studying and trying to understand and come to terms with the Holocaust, hopefully in 20 years, hopefully in 100 years, because we all struggle to understand some of the worst insults that we've levied, against other people as human beings. And so we try to make sense of the past and the present. And whether it's a Holocaust or the Rwandan genocide or the transatlantic slave trade or the war in the former Yugoslavia, one of those violent civil wars of the 20th century, we always strive to understand the evil in our midst and in order to help avoid it and to step around it and to prevent it from recurring. The same would apply to the many injustices that are meted out against Indigenous people in Canada. And so I think every generation will fight to engage, hopefully, with ideas such as critical race theory to understand the roots of human evil.
For sure. Thank you for that answer. And we have another question that's kind of related. So earlier you mentioned the lack of teaching about Canadian Black history. And certainly this was the case when I was an elementary or high school student decades ago. So do you know if any progress has been made in this area? Do history curriculums today include learning about Canadian Black history? I know this question isn't for me, but I can personally say that I have not learned much about Canadian Black history, even in recent years. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Thank you for your question. Well, I was born in 1957, so I'm growing up in the 1960s, and I can assure you that I heard not a word about Black history or Indigenous history or about the internment of Japanese Canadians in Canada during World War II, or about the Chinese head tax, or any such, blights against humanity. I heard nothing of this when I was going through the school system in, say, the 1960s and the early 1970s. Is it better today? Well, absolutely. I mean, I don't want to sing Canada to the skies, praise it to the skies, because we have a long way to go. So does our educational system have a long way to go. But I would say at least once a week, I get an email from a teacher who's teaching the Book of Negroes or the illegal or some other element of Black history and wants to have me talk to the kids, whether they're in, Brandon, Manitoba, or Dundee, Saskatchewan, Montreal, or Fredericton. I'm hearing from teachers who are talking to the kids about Black history. So it's not, of course, just my books, but many other books by many other tremendous Black Canadian writers are being read in schools as well. Dion Brand, Kinesia Lubrin, and David Cherryand. I could go on and on. Afua Cooper. There are many, George Eliot Clark. There are many brilliant writers who are Black, whose works are being read in schools today. Essie Duchin, who's won the Gillett Prize twice. These are just a few of the shining lights of African Canadian literature. So yes, they're being studied more. We are being studied more. And yes, teachers are engaging more, but there's a long way to go. And so we're beginning to sort of deal with this problem and to dip our toes into a more equitable way of thinking about the teaching of social sciences and history. And remember, Black history isn't Black history, it's Canadian history, but it's a part of Canadian history that's been eradicated from the curriculum or just swept under the rug. And so Black history is Canadian history. And so we're depriving all Canadians of a full knowledge of that history when we keep it out of the curriculum. So we're getting better for sure, but we have a long way to go.
I'd say I'm probably an in-between. of the two of you. And similarly, like I grew up in Canada and went to school in Canada, and I don't remember covering very much Black history, or, you know, that what I learned of Indigenous peoples in this country as well was very, very limited, or was not really a full picture or an accurate representation as well. So it's nice to hear that maybe there is some expansion of the curriculum happening. And that's certainly from some of the colleagues and friends I have that are teachers, something that I'm hearing as well. But yeah, certainly agree that there's quite a ways to go still. Yeah.
Yeah, and just a follow-up question, because you mentioned that, for example, if you were to talk to a 15-year-old today and ask them about Black history, the first name that probably comes to their mind is Rosa Parks. So I'm just wondering if you wanted to share with the audience some key Black Canadian historical figures that you think people should know more about.
Sure. Well, there's so many. How about Violet Desmond? Violet Desmond was a Black woman and a beautician who was arrested in a theater in New Glasgow in the 1940s because she was sitting in a part of the theater that was reserved for white people. So the theater was segregated. Actually, that very theater had not been segregated decades previously, but so many white leaders of New Glasgow complained about the fact that it wasn't segregated, that then the theater started getting segregated. And so Violet Desmond was arrested for sitting, you know, where she did not belong. And in a typically Canadian way, instead of charging her with sitting in a white-only section, she was charged with tax fraud because she had paid a little bit less for a ticket, like maybe 1 cent less for a ticket than a white person would pay for theirs, because she was supposed to sit in the peanut gallery. So instead of charging her with what she was really being charged with, it was called tax fraud, because she defrauded the theater maybe like half of 1 cent or something by sitting where she wasn't supposed to. And she appealed that arrest, and she lost, and she was convicted. She suffered terribly as a result of this, and her career was sent into a tailspin. And of course, many people disapproved of her making a fuss and arguing for her rights. So she paid a real price, you know, for advocating for her rights. So Violet Desmond would be one of many people that we could speak about. The first documented slave in Canada was an 8-year-old boy, presumably from Madagascar, named Olivier Lejeune. And he's the first documented slave in Canada. He's living in Quebec in 1628 as an 8-year-old enslaved boy, and he's owned by a Catholic priest, among other people. And he didn't live very long, but he's the first documented case we have of slavery in this country. There are many, many people who achieved the most astounding and fantastic achievements in the arts, in politics, in business, in teaching. I have many colleagues, you know, who are Black, you know, at the University of Guelph, where I teach, who are doing fantastic work, and I'm very proud of them. And so it's not just figures in our historical past, but all around us. We have leaders and dynamic people who are really doing wonderful things, and it's important to celebrate them and to know about them too. And by the way, you don't have to be famous or to be known across the country to do really valuable things. Sometimes the person who's volunteering in a soccer club, who's helping, you know, make lunches, you know, in the basement of a church or a synagogue, you know, or a mosque, is making a deeply valuable contribution to Canadian society too, even though they're not recognized. And so many of us are just ordinary people doing wonderful, ordinary, loving things, and they're just as vital and deserving of our celebration as our famous historical figures.
This question says, thank you. A real pleasure to be able to attend today. I wonder if you can comment further on how your identity was shaped by your parents and family. My experience has been growing up with parents who always affirmed my duality and biracial identity in particular. And nowadays, sometimes encountering a pressure to pick a side or suppress part of yourself in certain spaces or conversations. Any thoughts if you had similar experiences, or if you have observed these experiences in your own children? And curious how you mentally navigated these situations. How do you convey these concepts to your children as well?
Thank you. That's a big question. I wrote a whole book about it called Blackberry Sweet Juice on Being Black and White in Canada. So an entire book was dedicated to this subject. And it came out in 2001, actually, 21 years ago, and it's still around and still in libraries, and I'm still proud of it. In my experience, when I wrote that book and I was interviewing 34 other Canadians who, like me, had one white and one black parent, the time at which they really started to think about their identity and their blackness and their whiteness and how they would see themselves, the time that really started to boil over on the stovetop, so to speak, was when they were in their early adolescence. 13, 14, 15 is when these issues really started to bubble up. Just like so many other issues, your sexual orientation, your sexuality, your looks, your academic performance, all these things sort of suddenly become such a big deal when you're a teenager, especially an early adolescent. And racial identities seem to always be bubbling up among the people I interviewed around that time too. I am proud. I deeply loved and was always loving with and to and from my white mother, and I was very proud of her and very connected to her, and I've written about her a great deal. Her name was Donna Hill. But certainly in my case, and I'm not telling any other person what to do, it would have been an impossibility to call myself white. No way. Like, that's not happening. Does Obama call himself white? Well, of course not. The fact that he had a white mother is irrelevant. He's unable to maintain whiteness as a defining factor of his life. And if he tried to walk around the streets of Chicago or whatever, calling himself white, he would have been laughed, out of the room. And so I couldn't call myself white. It wasn't going to happen. It wasn't possible. And so sometimes you grow into what's possible, and then you try to make that beautiful and accept it. So my self-definition, pretty quickly evolved by the time I was a young teenager into blackness. It doesn't mean that there's any denial of my white heritage or any lack of love for the people, my mother and the other people in her family that I was quite attached to. There were some that were really beautiful and really great with us, including her twin sister, Dottie. But the primary identity became black, because for me, that was what would work. That's what was possible. That's what I could grow into and be. White I could never be. It wouldn't be possible to have walked around calling myself white. I would have been opposed at every turn socially. And so it's not to say what another person should do. And of course, as time goes on, self-definition becomes more and more at play, and people have more agency than they did, say, 50 years ago to decide how they want to see themselves. And sometimes, you have 7 kids in the same family. Some of them will think of themselves as black and others as white and others as mixed. And that's a good thing, because there's no way that we have to be. You sort of grow into what works for you. And even in the same family, we have great differences of how people might perceive themselves racially. And so I think you have to be comfortable and to be confident and to love yourself and to love the way you look and to decide, how you want to see yourself. But there is no right answer. And the fact that I kind of grew into seeing myself as black, as a light-skinned black man, but still very much black, doesn't mean that you have to see yourself that way. It just means that it's what worked for me. And the one thing I learned over the years is that you need to grow into a skin that works for you, and to be proud of that and to affirm it, whatever that is.
Imposter syndrome is something many Black students Black students actually experience. But coming from a background where both of your parents were basically part of Black history happening in Toronto, did you feel any type of pressure to also advocate or be a community leader of some sort?
Well, yes. My father, would sometimes say to me, as a child coming home, well, what did you do for humanity today, Larry? That's a pretty heavy line to throw at a 10-year-old. What did you do for humanity today? And my father was, a very public figure. He went to the Supreme Court to fight cases of racism. He headed up the Ontario Human Rights Commission, was Ombudsman of Ontario, gave 1,000 public lectures. He was very prominent in Canadian life. And my mother worked just as hard as he did in all these areas, but unfortunately didn't have his prominence or his fame. But she certainly worked as hard as he did, and did just as much as he did. So yes, I felt a lot of pressure, and I think that in immigrant and racialized families, the pressure to succeed can be really crushing. I think that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to become an artist in a Black family that's, say, a Black immigrant family. because it's not seen as an acceptable, respectable, safe, wise, economically smart thing to do. And it's not very economically smart, frankly. It's, to become an artist is not economically smart. Your chances are you'll do much better getting a job than trying to make it, as a filmmaker, a dancer, or a novelist. But you sort of have to live, you have to live and make your life work. And I'm very happy to have been able to do that. But yes, I felt a lot of pressure to succeed. I think in the Black middle class, there's a tremendous amount of that, as there are in other immigrant communities. But it helped me, and it just made me work that much harder, and but still to find the courage to go at it in the way I wanted, which was to become an artist.